Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise and bring you the essential insights, the things you really need to know to understand our, well, pretty complex world. Today, we're embarking on a really fascinating deep dive into India's evolving strategic landscape. The global stage, as you know, it's shifting dramatically. We're seeing conflicts, huge economic pressures, incredibly rapid technological shifts, and all these new alliances forming and reforming. Our mission today is simple. We're going to unpack a stack of critical sources, articles, research, expert notes, and pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge. We want to help you grasp not just what's happening, but crucially, why it matters and how these shifts might shape the world around you.
That's exactly right. The goal here is to give you a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed. We'll offer up some perhaps surprising facts, some critical insights that we hope will stick with you. We really want to help you connect the dots, maybe encourage that deeper, critical thinking about these quite complex global trends.
Okay, let's get started then. Looking at the bigger picture first, we're clearly seeing these broad shifts in the global order. What's fundamentally driving this new dynamic? What are the sources telling us?
Well, a key insight here, it seems, is the decline of what you might call post-war multilateralism. Those traditional institutions like the United Nations that were built after World War II, they're struggling, really struggling, to manage modern conflicts effectively. If you just think about the Russia-Ukraine war or the ongoing crisis in Gaza, their limitations in making a real difference on the ground are quite stark. And this feeds into what some analysts are calling a global polycrisis. And what that really means is it's not just one big problem hitting us, it's more like a tangled knot of interconnected challenges.
Right.
You've got wars, trade conflicts, pandemics like COVID-19, climate change, all happening at once and all feeding into each other. It makes setting global priorities incredibly complex, and it's reshaping how nations fundamentally interact.
And in response to that complexity, our sources point towards the rise of regional and agenda-specific alliances. We see platforms like BRICS, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa popping up. They seem to reduce reliance on Western-led systems, promote this idea of South cooperation. But importantly, the sources stress they're not necessarily anti-Western in their core.
Exactly. And that highlights a definite shift towards multipolarity. Power isn't just concentrated in one or two major players anymore, it's diffusing among many nations. Look at India's strategic economy, for instance, during the Ukraine conflict. They maintained diverse ties, didn't fully align with one side. That's a prime example of this multipolar approach in action. Another crucial trend we're seeing is what's called strategic self-help. Nations are really prioritizing resilience now in their supply chains, energy security, disaster response. Think about regional platforms like BIMSTEC, the Bay of Bengal Initiative. It fosters exactly that kind of regional cooperation for resilience.
So, okay, these are the big shifts. How is India actually leveraging them? It seems like there are several opportunities it's keen to capitalize on. For instance, stepping up as this voice of the global South, promoting a non-Western model of democracy. That move with the African Union, the G20, getting them included as a bloc, that was a big deal, wasn't it?
A huge diplomatic win, absolutely. And beyond that, India is really diversifying its global engagement. You see it in climate diplomacy, backing green growth, finance reform, the International Solar Alliance, the ISA, that's a major example. Or look at its digital public infrastructure successes, things like COWIN, their COVID vaccination platform, or UPI, the digital payment system that's just exploded. India is showcasing these scalable solutions that really resonate, particularly with the global South. It's subtly reshaping the global narrative around development and, frankly, influence.
That certainly sounds like a lot of proactive engagement, a lot of spinning plates. But what are the challenges? What hurdles does India face in trying to assume this complex role on the global stage?
Oh, there are significant hurdles, no doubt. Global cooperation itself is becoming more fragmented. Take the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Its dispute mechanism is weakened, and that really limits India's trade growth potential. I think the sources mentioned it only held about a 4.3% global trade share in 2023. It's something to consider.
Yeah.
Then there's the persistent climate justice divide. You see ongoing clashes between developed and developing nations over who pays for climate action. The debates around the loss and damage fund at COP27 were a clear example of that tension. And then basic geopolitics, rivalries, the shift to regional blocs. It all complicates building consensus. And deglobalization, protectionism, think US-China trade wars, or the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM.
That's the carbon tax on import.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That kind of thing directly hurts India's export competitiveness. Plus, you have the constant balancing act with major powers like the US and China, sometimes a relatively weak diplomatic footprint in key regions, and those persistent, unresolved border disputes. It's an incredibly complex juggling act.
Okay, let's dive deeper into one of those strands, India's positioning as the voice of the global south. This is a huge group, 147 countries, the sources say. What does leading or trying to lead this group truly mean for India's strategy?
Well, for India, the global south is really multifaceted. First, it significantly boosts its international influence. It lends crucial weight to its long-standing goal for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, the UNSC. Strategically, it's also a key part of India's multidirectional alignment approach. It helps subtly offset China's growing influence in many of these regions without necessarily being directly confrontational.
And economically?
Economically, it's vital. The Global South offers access to resources and, increasingly, represents a crucial, expanding market for Indian products and services. And India is actively positioning itself, moving beyond just traditional aid models. They're promoting what some have dubbed the Mumbai Consensus, an alternative model for democracy and human rights, drawing on older principles like Panchsheel or the non-aligned movement's legacy.
Sort of framing their own path.
Precisely. They're also acting as a first responder in crises, providing humanitarian assistance. Think of the Vaccine Maitri initiative during COVID-19, sending vaccines across the globe. They're leading on the global climate agenda too, with initiatives like the ISA and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, CDRI, and constantly pushing for reforms in multilateral institutions, demanding that UNSC permanent membership be broadened.
And financially, I think the sources mentioned some specific funds.
Yes. They contributed $25 million to a social impact fund focused on public digital infrastructure and launched a global development compact aimed at helping developing countries tackle debt crises. This whole approach highlights a really significant shift. It's moving away from, say, checkbook diplomacy towards something more people-centric, debt-light, climate-smart, and focused on sharing technology. It emphasizes unity, equity, innovation, using platforms like the G20 to push a different kind of global leadership.
It sounds like a very ambitious agenda, taking on a lot of responsibility. What are the main challenges India faces in trying to actually lead such a diverse group? It can't be easy.
No, it's definitely not. The biggest challenge, arguably, is competition with China. China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, often involves that checkbook diplomacy, which, as many sources note, it can lead to debt crises for recipient countries. India is trying to offer a more sustainable alternative.
So it's a direct competition for influence.
In many ways, yes. Then there's that delicate diplomatic challenge we touched on. How does India balance its crucial strategic partnerships with major powers like the US and Russia, while simultaneously trying to genuinely represent the often conflicting interests of the entire global South? Another critical point raised is India's own comprehensive national strength. Its manufacturing base, for example, isn't yet competitive enough to fully leverage its huge demographic dividend or integrate deeply into global supply chains. That impacts its overall economic heft and, consequently, its influence.
And the global south itself isn't uniform, is it?
Not at all. That's the final crucial challenge. It's not monolithic. The interests, economic, cultural, developmental priorities vary hugely. Think about the needs of landlocked African nations versus, say, small island states facing existential threats from climate change. Representing all of them is a monumental task.
This shift towards more complex, maybe fragmented world brings us to another phenomenon the sources highlight, minilaterals. These smaller groupings seem to be popping up everywhere. What exactly are they, and why this sudden prominence?
Right, minilaterals. Essentially, they're informal, targeted groupings, usually just 3 or 4 states. The idea is they come together to address very specific threats, contingencies, or security issues, often within a defined time frame. Think of the recent QUAD, that's the US, Japan, Australia, Philippines, formed pretty directly in response to Chinese actions in the South China Sea. Other big examples are the QUAD, AUKUS, I2U2.
So why now? Why are these smaller, more focused groups gaining traction compared to the big traditional alliances or institutions?
Well, the sources point to a few clear reasons. One is the perceived failure, or at least sluggishness, of those larger multilateral institutions. They often seem inactive or ineffective when facing new challenges. Think about ASEAN's relative silence on China's assertiveness in the South China Sea, or the UN's difficulties in responding decisively to the Russia-Ukraine war or the Israel-Hamas crisis. COVID also really exposed weaknesses in bodies like the WHO.
So gridlock in the big forums pushes countries towards smaller groups.
Exactly. Great power rivalry often paralyzes action in larger forums. And there's also sometimes what's described as the tyranny of the majority, where, for example, developed nations might resist developing countries' demands on issues like climate finance, leading developing countries to seek other avenues.
Okay, given those factors, what are the upsides of minilaterals specifically for India? How does it leverage these smaller, perhaps more agile groupings?
For India, minilaterals offer some pretty significant advantages. They really help foster strategic autonomy and this idea of multi-alignment. India can balance partnerships without becoming overly reliant on any single bloc. So, for example, it engages with the QUAD for Indo-Pacific stability, but it's also involved in platforms like the INSTC, the North-South Transport Corridor with Iran and Russia. It allows for flexibility.
Playing multiple fields, so to speak.
In a way, yes. Minilaterals are also excellent for tackling specific transnational problems, things like food security, water, energy. Look at I2U2, that's India, Israel, the UAE, and the US focusing on technology-driven agriculture. And critically, they help in reducing that China-centric dependence, both by shifting supply chains and by building alternative coalitions, like the Chip 4 Alliance aiming to coordinate semiconductor production.
That highlights their agility, their focus.
Yeah.
But if these smaller groups are so effective, isn't there a risk? Doesn't it potentially undermine the broader universal ideals of traditional multilateralism? Could it make solving the really big global challenges even harder?
That's a really critical question, and the sources definitely acknowledge these downsides. Minilaterals do present real challenges. They can lead to the exclusion of key stakeholders, which undermines broader global representation. An India-France-Australia trilateral, for instance, might leave out other important Indo-Pacific nations. These small groups also often lack the sheer resources needed to tackle systemic global challenges like climate change effectively. There's also the risk of creating exclusionary bloc politics, which can fuel geopolitical tensions. China labeling the QUAD and Asian NATO is a case in point.
And their informal nature.
That too. Their informal structures can reduce oversight and make agreements harder to enforce. Something like the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, SCRI, might lack binding commitments. Ultimately, yes, this can fragment global governance and erode the foundations of multilateralism, creating ambiguity compared to structured bodies like the WTO.
So, given these pros and cons, what's India's strategic takeaway? How does it plan to navigate this landscape of big institutions versus these smaller, nimbler groups?
India's approach, as reflected in the materials, seems to be embracing minilateralism alongside, not instead of, multilateralism. It aligns with this philosophy mentioned, Sarvajan Hitaya, Sarvajan Sukhaya, meaning everyone's benefit, everyone's happiness. So in practice, this means continuing to push hard for reforms at the multilateral level, like at the UN, to safeguard that universal rules-based framework. Because, frankly, multilateralism often benefits developing countries by giving them collective bargaining power. But at the same time, India is clearly utilizing the minilateral route for short-term specific objectives, leveraging their agility and focus when needed. It's a pragmatic, two-track approach.
Okay, let's shift gears now towards the economic impact of all these geopolitical shifts. The IMF's Global Financial Stability Report has been warning about elevated geopolitical risks. What does this actually mean for the global economy? What should we, be looking out for?
This brings us squarely to this concept of geoeconomic fragmentation, or GEF. And what that really means, fundamentally, is a policy-driven reversal of global economic integration. Instead of that highly interconnected global economy we've gotten used to over the last few decades, we're seeing nations increasingly prioritize strategic concerns. Things like friendshoring.
Shifting production to friendly countries.
Exactly. Or nearshoring, sourcing from countries closer geographically. It also involves nations exploiting economic dependencies for strategic leverage. It's economics meeting geopolitics head-on. And this GEF plays out through several channels. First, you see geopolitical alignments leading to a retreat from multilateralism, the emergence of distinct economic blocs, and more strategic national policies like America First.
Right.
Second, we're seeing a clear increase in trade restrictions, tariffs, non-tariff barriers, even currency manipulation accusations. Think of the U.S. threatening sanctions under COTSA, that's the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, or even hypothetical scenarios like NATO potentially imposing tariffs on countries buying Russian oil.
And what are the specific geopolitical risks driving driving this fragmentation? What are the sources highlighting?
Several key risks are really at play here. One is trade weaponization, the deliberate use of trade policy as a foreign policy tool. We mentioned potential U.S. secondary sanctions, but historically, think about the Western sanctions on India after its nuclear tests in 74 and 98. That actually forced India to rely more heavily on its domestic thorium reserves for energy. We're also seeing multiple threats converging on supply chains, not just rivalries, but conflicts, competition for resources, cyber attacks. It's coming from all angles. And finally, there are demographic and technological pressures on workforces, aging populations in some places, AI integration changing jobs, and cultural policies like Saudization, the Nidakot policies, which prioritize hiring nationals and can displace foreign workers. The implications of these risks are pretty far-reaching. There's a heightened risk of financial contagion shocks in one area spilling over through trade and financial links. These risks also dampen investor confidence, creating market uncertainty and volatility. The U.S.-China trade war's impact on stock prices was a clear example. And as we discussed, multilateral institutions get undermined, eroding trust and cooperation. Look at the WTO's struggling dispute settlement system.
So with these significant risks piling up, what are the key policy recommendations? How can countries like India manage them and build resilience?
The recommendations focus heavily on building buffers and resilience. First, enhancing financial oversight by integrating these country-specific geopolitical risks right into how financial institutions are supervised. For India, which relies on imports for about 85% of its energy needs, this means practical steps like diversifying energy sources and building up strategic reserves.
Makes sense.
Second, deepening financial markets with robust regulations, but also crucially, strengthening domestic production capacity. This reduces over-reliance on foreign investment. India's push for indigenous defense manufacturing is often cited as a success story here. Additionally, building supply chain resilience is absolutely key.
Yeah.
That involves initiatives like the SCRI, the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative with Australia and Japan, or the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, IPF. India is actually vice chair of the IPEF's Supply Chain Council Tiller, which is significant.
And countering dominance,
Yeah.
like the China plus one idea.
Exactly. Countering dominance through strategies like China plus one is becoming standard practice. That's where businesses actively diversify their production facilities beyond just China to ensure they're not overly exposed. In this era of rising geoeconomic fragmentation, the IMF tracks show something like 80% of risks are tied to supply chain disruptions and trade wars. Proactive policies like financial resilience, strategic buffers, and crisis readiness are just vital. And that China plus one strategy you mentioned, it's a direct response from companies. They were originally concentrated in China for low cost, but now, due to U.S.-China tensions, rising labor costs in China, data regulations, and this global push for resilient supply chains, they're actively looking elsewhere. India, through things like its production-linked incentive, PLI schemes, and new free trade agreements, FTAs, is really trying to seize this opportunity, although sources note challenges remain, like needing deeper integration into global value chains.
Okay, fascinating. Let's turn our gaze upwards now, towards space. We're hearing this term space diplomacy more and more. What exactly is it, and why is India emerging as such a prominent player?
Right, space diplomacy. It's essentially using space science and technology, rockets, satellites, data as a tool to foster global cooperation and advance foreign policy objectives. Think of it as similar to military diplomacy, but operating in the final frontier. And India has been incredibly active here. The sources highlight numerous agreements signed with over 60 countries and multilateral organizations, and interestingly, a vast majority of these have happened in just the last 5 years.
60 countries. Wow. What are some key initiatives?
Key initiatives include major partnerships like NISAR, that's the NASA Istazar Synthetic Aperture Radar Project. India also joined the U.S.-led Artemis Accords for lunar exploration. Commercially, ISR, India's space agency, launched 163 foreign satellites in just 5 years. They've assisted neighbors like Nepal with satellite development and shared their Anavik navigation system, India's own alternative to GPS. Regionally, the launch of the South Asian satellite was a landmark, boosting communication and disaster management capabilities among SAARC countries. And on the security side, India is a strong voice advocating for PEROS, the prevention of arms race in outer space.
That's a really comprehensive set of activities. So what's the bigger picture significance of space diplomacy for global relations? Why does it matter?
Its significance is immense, really. First, it clearly promotes international cooperation. The International Space Station with the US, Russia, Europe collaborating for decades is the classic example. Second, it directly addresses global challenges. Sharing satellite data is crucial for disaster response. The South Asian satellite is a perfect case study there. Third, it contributes to conflict prevention and arms control in space, building on frameworks like the Outer Space Treaty, which bans WMDs in orbit. And importantly, it helps develop space law and governance. Forums like the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, UN COPUOS, are vital for discussing rules for space activity and tackling emerging problems like space debris.
It sounds very promising, but surely there are challenges for India in pursuing this space diplomacy.
Oh, absolutely. It's not without its complexities. There's a delicate balance India has to strike between asserting leadership and fostering genuine collaboration. While the South Asian satellite boosted regional influence, some neighbors might have concerns about maintaining their own technological independence. There's also a technology gap in some areas. India still lags behind, say, the US and China in certain advanced space technologies, which can limit its ability to engage in some high-end collaborative projects.
And security concerns.
Yes, dual-use technology concerns are always present. The worry is that some space technology shared for peaceful purposes could potentially be misused by collaborating countries, perhaps for military applications like anti-satellite capabilities.
So considering those challenges, what's the path forward for India in space diplomacy? How can it navigate this?
The way forward seems to involve several strategic thrusts. One is aiming for global governance leadership, perhaps leveraging its advancements in reusable launch vehicle technology to propose frameworks for managing space debris, a growing global problem. For space security, enhancing cooperation within the QA on space situational awareness seems likely, alongside strengthening defense ties with nations like Israel and France for satellite surveillance tech. Commercially, continuing to use cost-effective satellite launches via NSIL, IOSRO's commercial arm, to attract global clients is key. And crucially, boosting capacity building for the global south, offering affordable space solutions, ground stations, and expanding programs like UNATI, which trains scientists from developing countries. That really aligns with its broader foreign policy goals.
Okay, let's turn now to a critical and often quite chilling aspect of global security: the rise in nuclear arsenals worldwide. What are the key findings from recent reports like CPRISE?
Yeah, the CIPRIA Yearbook 2024 paints a pretty concerning picture. It highlights a clear global trend of increased nuclear weapon development and deployment. What stands out for India specifically is the reported increase in its warheads from 164 in 2023 to 172 in 2024. This now puts it slightly ahead of Pakistan's estimated 170 warheads. But this isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a much broader global modernization drive. All 9 nuclear-armed states are actively upgrading their arsenals and their delivery systems.
So more weapons and more advanced weapons.
Essentially, yes. Globally, the estimate is around 12,121 warheads, and perhaps more worrying, about 2,100 of those are kept on high operational alert, basically ready for launch. Transparency between the US and Russia is also declining, so while the total number of warheads might be slowly decreasing due to dismantling retired ones, the number of deployed, usable warheads is actually increasing year on year.
It raises that fundamental question again. Why do nations pursue these weapons in the first place? What's the core motivation behind building and maintaining nuclear arsenals?
Well, the primary motivation, according to deterrence theory, is just that: deterrence. Nuclear weapons are generally considered weapons of deterrence, not weapons meant for actual warfighting. The idea is they maintain a balance of terror, ensuring mutual destruction if used, which theoretically prevents large-scale conventional conflict between nuclear powers.
Mutually assured destruction, MAD.
Exactly. Nations like India also acquire them specifically to counter nuclear-armed rivals in India's case, primarily Pakistan and China. There can also be domestic political pressures, with nuclear lobbies pushing for arsenals. And let's not forget the symbolism. Nuclear status is still seen as conferring prestige and global power status. It's no accident that all 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council are nuclear states. That history has certainly influenced India's past decisions.
Okay, so what's the specific threat perception for India in this current nuclear landscape?
For India, there are a couple of distinct threats highlighted in the sources. China's ongoing nuclear modernization is a major concern, especially if it signals a potential shift away from China's long-standing no first use NFU policy and its doctrine of minimum deterrence. Pakistan's nuclear posture is also critical. Pakistan pursues what's called a lower nuclear threshold and has developed tactical nuclear weapons, or TNWs. These are smaller battlefield nukes.
Designed to counter India's conventional military advantages.
Precisely. They're seen as a way to counter India's cold start doctrine, which is envisioned as a limited, swift, conventional incursion strategy by the Indian Army. This raises serious concerns about disproportionate responses and the risk of rapid escalation if tactical nukes were ever used on a battlefield. India has tried to call Pakistan's nuclear bluff, as seen after the Uri and Balakot incidents, but the risk remains.
These are incredibly sobering threats. What mitigation strategies are being proposed or pursued globally to try and de-escalate these nuclear risks?
Mitigation strategies generally focus on de-escalation, transparency, and arms control. One key proposal is for the US, Russia, and NATO states to publicly commit not to issue threats of nuclear use, which would lower the dangerous rhetoric we sometimes hear. Second, there's a strong push to get agreement on placing all tactical nuclear weapons, those battlefield nukes, into central, verifiable storage to prevent unauthorized or accidental use. And finally, the longer-term strategies involve gradual reduction and eventually freezing the size of nuclear arsenals, perhaps through something like a bilateral nuclear material production freeze, similar to the aims of the proposed Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, FMCT. But the critical understanding, the core message that comes through from all the sources is this. Nuclear weapons are fundamentally weapons of deterrence, not weapons of war. As the leaders of the 5 main nuclear weapon states jointly affirmed not long ago, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. As long as these weapons exist, their sole purpose should remain defensive to deter aggression and prevent war.
Okay, let's shift focus now to what's often called India's most valuable human resource, its vast diaspora. A recent parliamentary committee report really highlighted its growing importance. First off, what exactly constitutes the Indian diaspora and just how extensive is it?
Right, the diaspora. Well, there isn't one single official government definition, but generally it includes non-resident Indians, NRIs, citizens living abroad, and overseas citizens of India, OCIs. That OCI category actually merged with the older persons of Indian origin PIO status back in 2015, and the scale is just immense. India has the world's largest international migrant population, around 18 million people living outside India.
18 million, that's staggering.
It really is, and it's an incredibly diverse group. You have laborers, traders, political figures, highly skilled professionals, think Sundar Pichai at Google, Satya Nadella at Microsoft, and of course a huge number of students. India's engagement strategy with this vast network is often characterized under the 4 Cs: care, connect, celebrate, and contribute. The aim is to foster a deep, ongoing sense of belonging and connection to India.
It sounds like a potentially powerful global network. What's the significance of this diaspora, both for India itself and perhaps for the countries where they now live?
The significance is truly multi-layered. Socioculturally, the diaspora plays a huge role in preserving Indian traditions abroad and promoting cross-cultural understanding. Think of festivals, languages, religious practices thriving in places from Germany to Fiji. Economically, their impact is massive. India received an incredible $125.1 billion in remittances in 2023. That's about 3.4% of its GDP, absolutely crucial for its balance of payments.
$125 billion. Wow.
Yeah. Technologically, as we mentioned, Indian origin leaders are shaping the global tech industry. Politically, you have figures with Indian roots in high office across the globe. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, US Vice President Kamala Harris are prominent examples. This influences policies in host nations and definitely strengthens India's global standing. And for the destination countries, the diaspora brings huge benefits: diversity, multiculturalism, filling critical workforce gaps. Look at the million-strong Indian community in Kuwait, for example. They're vital to the economy there.
That's a huge list of positive impacts. But it can't all be smooth sailing. Are there significant challenges faced by this vast diaspora spread across the world?
Absolutely, there are serious challenges. In West Asia, for instance, being in conflict zones like Yemen or the Israel-Palestine region puts expatriates in direct danger, often requiring complex and costly evacuations. Job insecurity is also a persistent issue, especially for lower-skilled workers, due to localization policies like Saudization, the Nidcop policies which prioritize hiring nationals. This can force many to return to India.
And in the West, places like North America or Europe?
There, the challenges are different but still significant. Secessionist movements, like some pro-Khalistan protests we've seen in Canada, the UK, the US, Australia, can unfortunately strain diplomatic relations between India and those countries. Racism and discrimination, often linked to ethnicity, sadly persist. And there are immigration hurdles, things like tightened H-1B visa rules in the US or debates over birthright citizenship for children of visa holders.
So, given these positives and these very real challenges, what's the way forward? How can India strengthen its engagement with its diaspora effectively?
The way forward seems to involve several key areas. First, legal and policy reforms are crucial. Finalizing and actually enforcing the proposed Immigration Bill 2023 is needed to better protect migrant workers' rights. Establishing a comprehensive diaspora database and expanding grievance redressal mechanisms like the existing MedAd portal are also important steps. Second, it's about truly leveraging the knowledge and skills of the diaspora. This means better skilling programs for those seeking jobs abroad, but also fostering robust diaspora networks to actively convert what used to be called brain drain into brain gain, bringing expertise back to India, even remotely. Finally, ensuring safety and security is paramount. This includes enabling the portability of Social Security benefits through international agreements so people don't lose out when they move. And strengthening mutual legal assistance treaties, MLTs, is vital to protect diaspora members who become victims of crime abroad and to fight transnational crime effectively. To sum up this section, the sources often use this beautiful analogy, likening the Indian diaspora to living root bridges. They really are these vital, organic connections strengthening India's cultural, economic, and diplomatic ties with the world, often in ways that go far beyond traditional government-to-government channels.
Living root bridges. I like that. Okay, for our final section, let's try to pull some threads together and explore how India navigates this incredibly complex web of regional and global groupings and agreements that shape its interests. Where should we start this exploration?
Let's begin with the Indo-Pacific IP region itself and India's signature initiative there, the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, or IPOI. The Indo-Pacific region is just critical geopolitically and economically. Over half of global trade passes through it, something like 40% of the world's oil. For India specifically, a staggering 90% of its trade by volume and 80% of its critical energy imports transit this region. It's also, of course, the main theater for US-China rivalry.
And how does India define this vast region?
India defines it very broadly, stretching from the eastern coast of Africa all the way across to the western coast of the Americas. It's a very inclusive definition. India's vision for this region consistently advocates for a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific, with Southeast Asia, particularly ASEAN, positioned right at its center. It emphasizes a common rules-based order and promotes dialogue over the use or threat of force. Policy-wise, India aims to strengthen its traditional role as a net security provider and first responder, especially in the Indian Ocean part of the region. Enhancing maritime domain awareness through institutions like its Information Management and Analysis Center, IMO, is a key part of that.
And the IPOI specifically, what's that about?
The IPOI, it's about 5 years old now, is a non-treaty-based voluntary arrangement India launched back in 2019 at the East Asia Summit, EAS. It builds on India's earlier SAGAR initiative, that's Security and Growth for All in the Region, from 2015. The significance of IPOI is that it deliberately expands the Indo-Pacific focus beyond just hard security. It brings in economic and environmental challenges covering 7 pillars like security, ecology, resources, capacity building, disaster risk reduction, science and tech, and trade and transport. It's designed to align with ASEAN's own outlook on the Indo-Pacific and Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific FOIP vision. It's seen as a way to subtly counter China's assertiveness, enhance maritime security, and remain flexible and inclusive.
What are the challenges facing it?
Challenges include institutional gaps. It's quite loosely structured. There's geopolitical resistance, mainly from China. Resource constraints and regulatory hurdles exist. And some argue there's a representation deficit, with maybe not enough focus on East Africa, the Gulf states, or small island nations. The way forward suggested is to promote the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, IPEF, where, as we noted, India is vice chair of the Supply Chain Council, and leverage existing platforms like IORA, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, maybe expanding IPOI membership.
Okay, moving from the broad Indo-Pacific vision to a specific grouping, the QUAD. That's Australia, India, Japan, and the US. What's its essential nature and significance for India?
Right, the QUAD. It's generally described as a plurilateral framework of maritime democracies, sometimes called a global force for good. Crucially, the sources emphasize it's a diplomatic partnership, not a formal military alliance like NATO. Its stated purpose is to promote an open, stable, prosperous Indo-Pacific, focusing on practical cooperation in areas like health security, climate change, critical and emerging technologies, space, infrastructure, and cybersecurity.
And for India, what's the key significance?
For India, the QUAD provides a vital strategic balance against China's growing power in the region. This includes practical cooperation like the Malabar naval exercises. It helps ensure that vision of a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific, upholding international law like UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It also strengthens India's own Act East policy, enhances military interoperability, supports tech and economic cooperation, especially in crucial areas like semiconductors, and aids regional disaster response efforts.
But the QUAD faces challenges too, doesn't it? It's not without critics or difficulties.
Definitely. It faces several challenges. One is its limited institutionalization. It operates without a formal secretariat, making sustained action potentially harder. China, as we mentioned, strongly criticizes it, labeling it an Asian NATO and accusing it of having a Cold War mindset. There can also be diverging priorities among the members. India might focus more narrowly on regional security threats, while the U.S. might have broader global goals. Some argue it faces a bit of an identity crisis, struggling to carve out a role distinct from existing bodies like ASEAN or AORA. And U.S. focus can get diverted to Ukraine, the Middle East potentially diluting attention on the Indo-Pacific agenda.
India also has its own specific concerns regarding the QUAD, right? Things it's perhaps wary of.
Yes, that's important. India is quite protective of its strategic autonomy and worries about appearing too tilted towards the West if the QUAD becomes overly formalized or militarized. It needs to maintain its relationships with countries like Russia and Iran, who view the QUAD with skepticism. And India strongly resists the QUAD becoming a formal military alliance, largely because it's the only QUAD member that shares a long contested land border with China. That makes it uniquely vulnerable to direct military pressure. The suggested way forward for the QUAD involves gradual institutionalization, ensuring it complements rather than competes with existing regional bodies like ASEAN, maybe expanding partnerships to non-QUAD nations, and maintaining a degree of strategic ambiguity, focusing more on non-traditional security issues to avoid unnecessarily provoking China.
Okay, and finally, let's touch on AUKUS, Australia, the UK, and the US. This is a newer and explicitly defense-focused trilateral strategic alliance formed in September 2021. What are its main pillars and implications?
All right, AUKUS. It's built on two main pillars. Pillar one is the most talked about. The US and UK helping Australia acquire and develop conventionally armed, nuclear-powered submarines. This is a huge technological transfer. Pillar 2 is less discussed but also significant. It focuses on joint development and sharing of advanced capabilities in areas like cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, AI, quantum technologies, and undersea capabilities.
And its implications for the wider Indo-Pacific.
Well, its proponents argue it supports that same goal of a free, open, resilient, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. It clearly signals a renewed U.S. push for security partnerships in the region and marks a significant reestablishment of the UK's strategic footprint east of Suez. However, AUKUS has generated concerns. Some criticize a lack of clear narrative around its ultimate goals. China opposes it very strongly, especially the nuclear-powered submarine aspect, seeing it as destabilizing. Another point of discussion is the U.S. sharing this incredibly advanced nuclear propulsion technology with only one AUKUS partner, Australia, but not with other key regional partners like India or Japan.
How does AUKUS sit alongside the QUAD? Are they complementary or competing?
They're generally seen as distinct but potentially complementary. AUKUS is unambiguously a hard security, defense-focused alliance. The QUAD, as we discussed, is a broader strategic cooperation framework covering many non-military areas as well. For India, AUKUS is seen as potentially strengthening the QUAD's overall ability to address China as a common strategic challenge. It might also open up opportunities for deeper defense collaboration between India and France, given France's initial displeasure with AUKUS and India's already strong strategic ties with Paris. India had apparently sought France's inclusion.
But India must have some concerns about AUKUS too.
Yes, definitely. One potential concern is an erosion of India's own influence in the eastern Indian Ocean if nuclear-powered submarines become a more common feature, operated by Australia. There's also the fact that India's very broad definition of the Indo-Pacific might clash with the potentially narrower, more maritime-focused view often associated with AUKUS or U.S. strategy. AUKUS, in essence, really highlights some of India's core strategic dilemmas. How much should it rely on others versus building its own capabilities to manage China's rise? Does it want to share the burden of containing China or bear more of it itself? And how deep should its reliance on the U.S. as a defense partner become? These are big, ongoing questions.
What an incredible journey we've taken today. We've really navigated the intricate web of India's strategic vision, wow, from its aspirations as the voice of the global South to how it's handling a fragmented global economy, embracing these new minilateral alliances, using space for diplomacy, managing those ever-present nuclear threats, and empowering its vast diaspora, those living root bridges connecting nations and cultures.
Indeed. I think if there's one key insight we've pulled from all these sources, it's that the world is just no longer about simple blocks or single dominant powers, if it ever truly was. It's a dynamic, definitely multipolar, polycrisis-ridden landscape out there, and it demands incredible agility, this concept of multi-alignment, and a focus on collective self-help from nations. India, with its own complex internal dynamics and its significant external ambitions, is undeniably a crucial player shaping this future as we speak.
Absolutely. So as you go about your day, maybe here's something to mull over, a final thought from our deep dive. In this era of geo-economic fragmentation, where exactly should countries like India draw the line between strategic self-reliance, building things at home, and the undeniable benefits that still come from global integration and trade? And how can those living root bridges of the diaspora truly shape this evolving world order, connecting nations and cultures in ways that maybe traditional diplomacy just cannot? What stands out most to you from everything we've unpacked today?